Your sister is the one who deserves a legacy, Amelia. You're just the one carrying it for her. You sign the papers, Maya gets the baby, the $450,000 hits the trust, and you go back to your quiet little life. My father, Thomas Whitaker, didn't even flinch as he spoke. He slid the legal waiver across the polished mahogany table with the cold precision of a blackjack dealer. He wasn't looking at me. He was looking at my 6-month pregnant belly with 100% calculation and zero fatherly warmth. He wasn't asking for a favor. He was ordering me to liquidate my unborn daughter so my sister could unlock our grandfather's inheritance. Before I tell you how I handled a father who tried to harvest his own grandchild for a payday, drop a comment and let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. I want to see how far this story travels. No. The word was barely a whisper, but it shattered the room. Thomas didn't argue or try to plead his case. His face didn't show the disappointment of a father. It twisted into the mask of a creditor being denied a payment he'd already spent. It belongs to her, he bellowed. He lunged across the table, his hands slamming into my shoulders with enough force to send me stumbling back. My heel caught the edge of the hardwood and suddenly the safety of the room was gone, replaced by empty air and the steep drop of the stairs leading to the foyer. In that moment of weightlessness, I didn't panic. I'm an ER nurse. Panic is a luxury I traded away years ago for competence. As the world tilted, I didn't reach out to save myself. I tucked my chin and curled my body inward, transforming myself into a human shield for the life growing inside me. I hit the first landing with my shoulder, then my hip, then felt the sickening crunch of ribs against the final wooden step. I landed on the floor, gasping for air. Above me, Thomas stood at the top of the stairs. He wasn't rushing down to help. He was watching with clinical detachment, waiting to see if his problem had finally been fixed. I didn't scream. I didn't even gasp. The word no had barely left my lips before the atmosphere in the sunroom didn't just change. It shattered. Thomas didn't try to persuade me with logic or guilt. His face simply twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. It wasn't the anger of a father disappointed in his child. It was the fury of a creditor being denied a payment he'd already gambled away. It belongs to her, he bellowed, his voice cracking with a desperation that made my skin crawl. Before I could even shift my weight, he lunged. His hands slammed into my shoulders with a violence that felt clinical, like he was trying to shove a piece of furniture out of his way. My heel caught the edge of the rug and suddenly the safety of the room vanished. The mahogany table was gone, replaced by empty air and the steep hard wooden steps leading down to the foyer. Gravity took over. In that split second of weightlessness, my brain didn't panic. As an emergency room nurse, I know that panic is a luxury for people who aren't fighting to stay alive. As the world tilted and the horizon flipped, I didn't reach out to break my fall with my wrists. I knew they would snap like dry kindling. Instead, I tucked my chin hard against my chest. I curled my body inward, wrapping my arms tight around my midsection, transforming myself into a human shield for the 6-month-old life growing inside me. I hit the first landing with my shoulder, the impact jarring my teeth. Then my hip took the brunt of the second. Finally, there was the sickening wet crunch of ribs against the edge of the final stair. I landed on the floor, the breath knocked out of me, staring up at the balcony. Thomas stood at the top, looking down. He wasn't horrified. He wasn't rushing down to help his pregnant daughter or calling for an ambulance. He was simply waiting. He was watching to see if the fall had fixed the problem. My training kicked in before the pain did. Airway patent, breathing shallow but present. Sharp pain in the left lateral chest wall, likely a rib fracture. I palpated my abdomen. It was soft with no immediate cramping. Then came the only check that mattered. I held my breath until my lungs burned, waiting for a sign from the dark. A flutter. A tiny protesting kick against my palm. Fetal movement detected. She was alive, and in that moment, the daughter who had spent 29 years trying to be good enough for Thomas Whitaker died on those steps. The woman who rose from the floor was something else entirely. A prosecutor. And I was going to make sure my father paid every cent of the debt he'd just created. I lay there on the cold, damp grass, the world spinning in slow, dizzying circles. The air felt thin, like I was trying to breathe through a straw. Every nurse knows the golden rule. In a trauma, you don't move until you've accounted for the damage. I closed my eyes, tuning out the looming shadow of my father at the top of the stairs, and began a mental head-to-toe assessment. Airway, Patent. Breathing. Rapid, shallow but clearing. I forced a deep breath and a white-hot spike of agony shot through my left side. I didn't need an X-ray to diagnose the rib fracture. I could feel the jagged edge of the bone protesting with every movement. My hip was a dull, throbbing mess of heat, likely a massive hematoma in the making. But those were secondary concerns. They were mother problems. I needed to know about the baby problems. I slid my hand down, trembling, and pressed my palm against the hard curve of my stomach. The silence was deafening. In the ear, silence is usually the sound of a heart that has stopped beating. I felt a surge of cold, primal terror that threatened to break my professional composure. "Please," I whispered, the word catching in my throat. I ignored the screaming protest of my chest and pressed deeper, searching for a sign of life in the wreckage Thomas had created. I waited. 1 second. 5. 10. Then a soft, rhythmic thud. It wasn't a heartbeat. It was a movement. A sharp, distinct jab against the heel of my hand. Then another. It was a tiny, defiant protest from a life that refused to be extinguished for a trust fund. Fetal movement. He was still there. She was still fighting. The relief was so violent it felt like another fall. I let out a jagged breath, my tears finally blurring the image of my father as he stood silhouetted against the sunroom lights. He was still just watching, a vulture waiting for the struggle to end. But he had miscalculated. He thought he had liquidated an asset. He didn't realize he had just turned a daughter into a lethal adversary. I wiped the sweat and dirt from my face with a bloody knuckle. My pain didn't matter anymore. The triage was over and the counterattack was about to begin. I drove myself. It was a reckless, agonizing 3-mile journey, but I couldn't risk calling an ambulance that might be intercepted or influenced by the Whitaker name. Every time I turned the steering wheel, my fractured ribs gritted together like broken porcelain. My father's silhouette, stationary and cold at the top of those stairs, burned in my rearview mirror. He hadn't even checked for a pulse. In his eyes, I wasn't a daughter in distress. I was a failing investment, a piece of equipment that had malfunctioned and needed to be discarded. I bypassed the community hospital 3 blocks away. I knew their staff and more importantly, I knew their security was soft. I needed my own turf. I pulled into the staff bay of the trauma center where I'd spent the last 5 years suturing wounds and managing crises. As the automatic doors hissed open, the familiar scent of antiseptic and floor wax hit me, and for the first time since the sunroom, I felt a flicker of safety. "Amelia? What happened?" The charge nurse, Sarah, was at my side in seconds, her eyes wide as she took in my grass-stained clothes and the way I was cradling my midsection. "Fall from height," I said, my voice clinical and detached. I was speaking the language of the job because it was the only thing keeping the scream at bay. "Direct impact to the left lateral thorax. Fetal movement present but needs urgent Doppler. I need an official forensic intake. No visitors. Especially not family." As they settled me into a trauma bay, the realization settled in with a chilling clarity. Thomas's rage hadn't been an emotional outburst. It was the calculated fury of a man who had already spent the money my baby was supposed to unlock. I wasn't a person to him. I was a $450,000 line item. By refusing to sign that waiver, I hadn't just defied him, I had bankrupted him. The cold gel of the ultrasound probe hit my skin, and a moment later, the room was filled with the rapid rhythmic thump-thump-thump of a healthy heart. My baby was fighting. Sarah squeezed my hand, but I wasn't looking at her. I was looking at the police officer entering the bay to take my statement. The Whitakers had spent years treating me like a vessel they could manipulate and discard. They were about to find out what happens when you try to liquidate an ER nurse who knows exactly how to document a crime. The time for being good enough was over. Now I was going to be their reckoning. My phone didn't stop vibrating for 3 hours. It buzzed against the hospital bedside table with a frantic, rhythmic persistence that felt like an extension of the violence from the sunroom. 32 messages from Thomas Whitaker. I didn't open a single one. I didn't need to. I knew the cycle of narcissistic desperation by heart. First come the threats, then the gaslighting concerns about my health, and finally the bargaining. Tactical silence is a term we use for high-stress de-escalation, but in the world of toxic families, it's known as the gray rock method. You become as uninteresting and unresponsive as a pebble on a beach. You offer no emotion, no fuel, and most importantly, no information. While the nurses adjusted my fore and the dull ache in my ribs settled into a steady throb, I watched the screen light up over and over. Each notification was a digital thumbprint of a man losing control of his asset. By 10 p.m. the vibrating finally stopped. That was the danger zone. That was the moment Thomas would start looking for a new way to exert pressure. I waited another hour, letting the silence fester on his end, making him believe I was truly broken. Or worse, that I was already talking to someone he couldn't control. My hand was steady as I finally picked up the device. I didn't address his insults or his demands for the signed waiver. I didn't mention the stairs or the bruises. I needed to feed him exactly what he wanted to see. A victim who was ready to fold. I typed out 6 words. I am scared. I'm willing to talk. I hit send and immediately turned the phone off. In the we call this setting the bait. By appearing weak, I was inviting him into a controlled environment where his arrogance would become his own prosecutor. He thought he was winning back his $450,000. He didn't realize that by responding, I had just lured him into the center of a forensic web. The gray rock wasn't just a shield anymore. I was sharpening it into a blade. The next time we met, it wouldn't be in a sunroom with no witnesses. It would be in a room where every word he spoke would be his last. Preparation for the meeting felt less like a medical routine and more like a theatrical ritual. I sat before the mirror in my quiet apartment, the humming of the refrigerator the only sound in a room that suddenly felt like a war room. I wasn't just going to see my father. I was going to present him with the image he expected to see. In his world, I was a defeated asset and I was going to give him that version of me until the handcuffs clicked shut. I started with my face. The natural yellowing of the bruises on my jaw was already there, but I used a touch of matte eyeshadow to deepen the purples and blues, subtly emphasizing the trauma of the fall. I wasn't creating a lie. I was highlighting a truth he had tried to ignore. I wanted the visual evidence of his rage to be the first thing he saw. Next came the ribs. I stripped off my shirt and began to wrap my torso in thick, elastic medical bandages. I cinched them tight, not just for the support my fractured bone needed, but to create a visible, bulky silhouette beneath my sweater. Every breath was a sharp reminder of the stairs, but the restriction was a comfort. It was armor. I looked down at the pale, white wrap and thought of the vessel Thomas had tried to break. Beneath the gauze, my daughter kicked, her movements strong and rhythmic. She was the reason for the performance. I chose an oversized, faded hoodie, something that made me look smaller, more fragile. I avoided my usual nurse's posture, letting my shoulders slump and my head hang. I practiced the walk, a slow, guarded shuffle that protected my left side. By the time I was finished, the woman in the mirror looked like a victim on the verge of total collapse. Thomas Whitaker wanted a signature on a waiver. He wanted me broken enough to sign over my child for $450,000. He would walk into that law office expecting to find a daughter who had finally learned her place. He wouldn't see the recording device taped to my inner thigh or the cold, clinical fire in my eyes. He wouldn't see the predator until it was too late. I took one last shallow breath, grabbed my keys and walked out the door. The stage was set. The law office of Henderson and Associates felt like a mausoleum, cold, quiet, and smelling of old paper and expensive wax. I arrived 20 minutes early, moving with the labored, protective gait I'd practiced in the mirror. Every gingerly placed step was a message. As I sat in the high-backed leather chair in the waiting room, I caught the eye of the receptionist. I saw her gaze linger on the purple-hued bruise blooming along my jawline and the way I winced when I shifted my weight. I knew exactly what she was seeing, a domestic violence victim. As a healthcare worker, I knew her training would kick in. She was a mandatory reporter and I was giving her plenty to report. Mr. Henderson, the trustee of my grandfather's estate, opened his heavy oak doors and froze for a fraction of a second when he saw me. He was a man of strict legalities, but he wasn't a monster. "Amelia," he breathed, his eyes scanning the damage. "What happened to you?" "I had a fall, Mr. Henderson," I said, my voice thin and carefully fragile. I didn't blame Thomas. Not yet. I needed the environment to be controlled. "My father is on his way. He said we need to finalize the waiver for Maya today." I made sure to leave the heavy office door slightly ajar, a small, tactical adjustment. I wanted the staff in the hallway to hear every word of the negotiation. I needed a chorus of witnesses who weren't on the Whitaker payroll. Amelia, you are under no obligation to sign this under duress, Henderson said, leaning forward, his brow furrowed. I just want the pressure to stop, I replied, touching the bulky medical wrap beneath my hoodie. He told me inheritance is more important than anything else. He said I was just the vessel. I saw Henderson's jaw tighten. He began pulling files, his movements sharp and deliberate. He was no longer just a trustee. He was becoming a witness to a crime. Just as the elevator down the hall chimed, signaling my father's arrival, I felt a familiar, sharp kick against my ribs. It was a reminder of why I was sitting in this cold room, wearing fake bruises and real pain. Thomas Whitaker was about to walk into a sanctuary of the law, thinking he was the predator. He had no idea that the room was already wired with the silent testimony of everyone who had looked at me today. The trap was set and the asset was ready to speak. Thomas Whitaker entered the room like a man who already owned the air inside it. He didn't look at my face. He looked at the legal documents on the desk. He didn't even acknowledge the way I leaned heavily against the chair, or the visible tremor in my hands. To him, I was just a broken lock that had finally clicked open. Good. You're here, he said, his voice grating and impatient. Henderson, let's get this moving. We've wasted enough time on this dispute. Mr. Henderson didn't move. He sat with his hands interlaced, his eyes fixed on Thomas with a cold, professional curiosity. Amelia has expressed some concerns about the nature of this transfer, Thomas. She feels under pressure. Pressure. Thomas laughed, a sharp, jagged sound. He paced the small office, his movements frantic. She doesn't understand the reality of the situation. This isn't about her feelings. It's about trust. I've already moved the first 100,000 to cover the shortfalls in the estate's secondary accounts. If that waiver isn't signed, the auditors are going to see the adjustments I made. I lowered my head, letting my hair fall over the bruise on my jaw. You embezzled the money, Dad? I whispered, my voice sounding small and defeated. I managed it, Amelia. There's a difference, he snapped, leaning over the table. The mask was slipping now. I had to borrow something. Private parties to keep us afloat after the market dipped. Hard money lenders don't care about family legacies. They care about their vigor. If Maya doesn't get that inheritance to backfill the accounts, they're coming for the house. They're coming for everything. He leaned closer, his breath smelling of stale coffee and desperation. I even had to forge your grandfather's signature on the initial loan applications just to buy us time. Do you realize what happens to me if you don't do this? I go to prison, Amelia. Is that what you want? To destroy your father over a child you haven't even met yet? I looked up then, meeting his gaze. For the first time, I didn't see the giant who had ruled my childhood. I saw a small, panicked man who had traded his daughter's safety for a gambler's debt. He had just confessed to embezzlement, forgery, and extortion in a room with a mandatory reporter and an open door. I've met her, Dad, I said, my voice finally steady. She kicked when you pushed me down the stairs. And she's the one who's going to watch you lose everything. The silence following my declaration didn't last long. It was Karen who broke it, her heels clicking sharply against the hardwood as she moved toward me, her eyes like chips of flint. She didn't look like a mother. She looked like a predator that had finally cornered its prey. You think you're so clever, Amelia, she hissed, her voice low and vibrating with malice. But look at you. You're a mess. A frantic, unstable girl who fell down some stairs. Do you really think any court would leave a child with a mother who can't even keep herself safe? If you don't sign that paper, I will spend every cent we have left to ensure you are declared unfit. I'll finish what the stairs started. I'll take that baby and I'll make sure you never see her again. I didn't blink. I didn't have to. I simply reached up and adjusted the collar of my hoodie, a small, deliberate movement that served as the final trigger. From the secondary conference room, the heavy doors swung open. Sergeant Michael O'Neill stepped out first, followed by two officers in tactical vests. The clinical, sterile air of the law office was suddenly charged with the electricity of an active arrest. Thomas's face didn't just go pale. It turned a sickly, translucent white. He collapsed into a chair, the bravado of the creditor, vanishing instantly. Thomas Whitaker, Karen Whitaker, you are under arrest for extortion, criminal solicitation and investment fraud, O'Neill announced, his voice a calm, rhythmic hammer. Maya, who had been hovering in the corner like a silent accomplice, let out a sharp, choked sob. Before the handcuffs could even clear O'Neill's belt, she was moving away from our parents, her hands raised in a frantic gesture of surrender. "It was them," she wailed, pointing a shaking finger at Thomas. "He told me he'd handle the accounts. He said the stairs were an accident, but then he told me if Amelia didn't sign, we'd all be on the street. I didn't want any of this. Please, I'll tell you everything about the loans, just don't take me." The betrayal was instantaneous and total. Karen looked at her golden child with a shock that mirrored my own fall, while Thomas simply stared at the floor, the weight of his forged signatures finally pulling him under. As the officers moved in to read them their rights, I felt a familiar rhythmic pulse against my ribs. Hick. My daughter was still fighting. And for the first time in 29 years, I wasn't the one who was broken. They were. The silence of my new home was the most expensive thing I had ever owned. I sat in a rocking chair in a nursery that smelled of fresh lavender and hope, far away from the sunrooms and mahogany offices of my former life. The Whitaker name was a ghost now, something I had buried alongside the fake bruises and the medical bandages. But the poison of a narcissistic family doesn't dissipate just because handcuffs click shut. 2 weeks after the arrests, the final retaliatory strike arrived in the form of flashing red and blue lights reflecting off my windows. A wellness check. My mother, Karen, had used her one phone call from jail to trigger a contingency plan, claiming to a 911 operator that I was mentally unstable and a danger to my unborn child. She couldn't have me, so she tried to have the state take me instead. I didn't panic when the officers knocked. I didn't scream or cry. I simply opened the door, handed them my medical credentials, and showed them the video recording from Mr. Henderson's office. I watched the tension leave the sergeant's shoulders as he realized he was being used as a weapon in a dead woman's war. He apologized, noted the harassment in the file, and left me to the quiet. That night, I signed the final papers. Not the waiver Thomas had wanted, but the ones that legally changed my identity. I severed the last tether. Thomas was facing years for embezzlement and feticide. Karen was trapped in a web of extortion and false report charges. And Maya was a pariah, disinherited by the very estate she had tried to steal. I placed my hand on my stomach, feeling the rhythmic, strong heartbeat of the girl who had survived a flight of stairs and a family of vultures. "You will never be a vessel," I whispered into the stillness. "You will never be an asset or a line item. You will just be loved." The cost of this piece had been my history, my family, and my physical safety. But as I looked out at the moon over a garden where no one was watching to see if I'd fallen, I knew I had won. I wasn't the victim they tried to liquidate. I was the one who had survived the crash and walked away with everything that mattered. If you've ever had to cut off the hand that was supposed to hold you just to save your own life, type "peace" in the comments and don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel. Thank you for listening.